All right, folks, welcome back to Flat Iron Tuning. We're here because it is time to take a deep look at this BR, the Boxer Rally Spec Z, the all-wheel drive BRZ that we've seen a lot of video and images from in Japan. And they've now run their first All-Japan Rally. And Love Cars, they actually put out another video, and I'll put a link in the description, where they actually did a walk around with Arai-san and Mr. Yamamoto from Subaru months before this car was unveiled, and so it was in process. And what's cool about this is that there are some glimpses, like we could see the front diff, the rear diff, the front suspension, rear suspension, a lot more details because the car isn't complete and a lot of things are open. And so there's a ton to talk about here. We've got to take a deep look at it. But before we do, I want to say, just make sure you like, subscribe, hit that hype button if you see it. That helps us out a ton. We greatly appreciate your support. Let's get into it. I've got my laptop here, so I've got some images, but you're going to see on the screen what I'm looking at here. First and foremost, let's talk about the front suspension. So this is where they had to do a lot of change because they moved the engine back, and what they said is they moved it back about 150 millimeters, which is about 6 inches. And you can see that it's basically right up to the firewall. And in doing that, they basically created their own billet front subframe to support the engine, and they put the steering rack on the front of this subframe. They're using billet knuckles. So they're connecting the tie rod to the front of the knuckle, the strut to the rear, but then now the axle has to go through the middle. So we see that. The thing to note here is with the front suspension, the front struts are actually tipped forward. And I'm sure, like, there's this one image where you can see the front differential through, you know, without an axle in it, basically where the suspension is. And pretty much, I think the reason that the strut is tipped is because that's where the axle has to go. So in doing so, they're really compromising the geometry of the front suspension, which is this burly KYB rally strut. I mean, this is probably the coolest KYB strut I've ever seen, read, or heard about. I kind of wish I could get access to these or knew more about them. They did what they had to do to get everything to work and to make this BRZ all-wheel drive with the framework of the BRZ as it was. But I think if it was ever possible for them to basically flip-flop the front strut and the steering rack, there'd be a huge benefit there, because then the front strut would be more at a proper angle to go with what I'm assuming is going to be a lot of positive caster and movement of the front lower control arm, which would be more beneficial for front grip. And but you still have to steer the car, so you got to connect the tie rod somewhere somehow. But again, the cool thing is you can see that the diff placement underneath the engine there, and so the engines move back and then up. So that's how they're able to get the front to work. There's an image here where the turbo is on the other side of the firewall. They've got a big hole in the firewall and they put the turbo behind it. I think there's a lot of good reasons to put the turbo there because, one, it's more protected in a rally car. Two, they put a front diff kind of where the turbo would, or at least a lot of the exhaust would have to be. So yeah, getting the turbo routing or the exhaust routing to the turbo would be a lot more of a challenge with the front diff there. So this gives them more options. But this is one of the things we got to start thinking about. There's a lot of design elements of this car that don't make sense for a production car, which then leads the question of, like, okay, well, what if Subaru designed a car with this kind of a layout in mind? But put a pin in that, we're going to come back to it. Let's go back to the rear suspension. So the rear suspension, they changed it. It's a McPherson rear suspension, so they kind of welded in the entire support for the rear strut. So this is a more correct orientation for the rear strut to absorb the bumps and have the the camber pickup that you would want in a long travel gravel suspension. It looks very similar to your traditional Subaru rally suspension, and the diff is tucked back there. Everything is billet, everything is well done. I mean, it's a proper rally car build. They obviously took their time with it, and you can tell that, like, they really want to explore this concept, and they're doing what they need to do in the BRZ chassis to get this drivetrain in. Another point to this is you can see where they basically had to modify the transmission tunnel to get the transmission to fit. They had to move everything back in the passenger compartment. So you've got the pedal box pushed back a significant degree. Obviously, the co-driver, his seat is going to have to get pushed back a pretty good amount, because now you got a turbo sitting right in front of him and all that. And there's some good images of that in here that you can see. That's what Subaru has done to the car. Now the question is, okay, well, do you have this car that's heavily modified with this movement of the engine and the suspension to get this drivetrain to work in a BRZ that was not designed to be all-wheel drive? And again, in doing so, they've got the engine so far back that this is basically a front mid-engine car. But obviously, they've had to do a lot of work to get this to fit and to get this to work. Let's take a look. We're in the shop. We've got the Pikes Peak car on the left. Let's go back there and let's take a look at what does a non-modified WRX look like in terms of space? What does the placement of the engine look like? What is the placement of the transmission, the front axle, all that sort of thing? And then let's come back and talk about what this could mean again if Subaru decided, hey, we actually want to implement this kind of design to a production car. All right, let's head back to the shop. Here's the question. So if we're going to talk about changing the configuration, how much room does Subaru just have to work with right from the word go? Which is basically what the guys, Team RI have done with the BRZ, the BR Spec Z. So let's just look at it. So if we put a tape measure on the firewall and we just come forward to where just the bell housing is. So where does the engine start? Yes, there's a lot of stuff in the background, but it's kind of about 12 or 13 inches, which is about 33 centimeters, so 330 millimeters from the firewall to where just the engine fundamentally starts. So if you were designing a car from scratch and you wanted to kind of keep the same passenger compartment to firewall relationship, how much could they move the engine back? I mean, it seems like probably 8, 10, maybe even 12 inches you could actually move everything back if you designed like the fittings to the firewall and the transmission and everything like that. You could move the engine that far back. But now let's look underneath. Let's look at where the placement is of the front axles for comparison. All right, so we're underneath the car now, and my hand is basically directly underneath the front axle. So that's coming out of the front differential. The engine bell housing is gonna start right about here. So there's probably about this much room between where the front axle is and basically where the engine starts. So let's call that maybe 8 inches. Yeah, I'm gonna call that 8 inches. So basically, if they could move the engine back 8 inches and then move the front differential forward 8 inches, that would move the front axle forward a lot, but I think that there would probably be a decent amount of room underneath the engine because the engine itself is only about, even to the front of the headers, about 14 inches from the back to the front. So if this goes back 8 inches and they do something different with the headers, or that hot H configuration, if this is now the intake for the car, you just have to get the differential to play nice with the oil pan. And then if the front differential is here, I put the front axle here or thereabouts. That moves the front wheel a lot further forward, and then you have that front mid weight configuration. And then just for a rough sense here, currently to the front of the car from the axle, we've got about 34 inches, 35 inches. So there is a ton of space from the front axle to the front of the car. This is that overhang. So if they move the axle forward, the overhang would go down significantly. The footprint of the car would go up significantly, but then the weight distribution is going to be a lot better because you're going to have all of that weight of the engine and the transmission much more in the center of the car, in the middle, rather than having it stick basically so far over the front axle. All right, so the long and short of it is there's a lot of room if Subaru knew going into designing a car that they wanted to do this. And could they change the drivetrain layout of the car to facilitate putting a transmission in that has basically this transfer case with a front and a rear prop shaft? Now, the first thing to note when we're talking Subaru and all-wheel drive, it's a symmetrical all-wheel drive. That's what makes the Subaru all-wheel drivetrain unique, is the symmetrical all-wheel drive system. The biggest piece to that is that basically the front and the rear axles, left and right, are the same length. This is what negates any kind of torque steer, front or rear, and kind of makes the Subaru drivetrain work the way that it works. And so how do you do that with the transmission, with the transfer case? It's a little bit tricky. I mean, maybe if you offset the transmission to this side, have the transfer case come back down into the center so that you can have the front and rear prop shafts just be completely centered, that would make sense. Now, looking at our WRX, STI, the Pikes Peak car, you could probably move that engine back 6, 8, maybe even 10 inches without really having too much of a trouble. And then to move the front axle forward, you could probably move the front axle forward 6 inches without too much trouble. I mean, there's enough real estate that if you did that, it would be possible. And then really, if you have the prop shaft coming forward, you just have to design the oil pan to accommodate it. But again, like what we've seen with the BRZ GT300 with the exhaust manifolds on top, if they would do that so that basically the cold air, the air inlet for the engine is going from the bottom, I think they'd have a lot more real estate. It'd be a lot easier to design ducting to get the fresh air in the bottom and have the exhaust come out the top. Maybe a lot of what we're seeing with Subaru, or with what Subaru is doing with some of these BRZ concepts and race cars, is improving concepts for a production car. But if the Subaru was going to design a car that actually had all of this in mind and functional, what would it look like? Do we just have to kind of imagine what this could look like? And it turns out the answer to that is no. If you go back all the way to 2013, there was a concept car for the WRX, which ended up being the VA WRX, the 2015 WRX. But in 2013, they came out with a concept car. And the proportions of this concept car were significantly different. And this is exactly what Subaru did. Now, back to our video about the CAFE standards. My strong speculation at this point is that Subaru's reason for making the concept with this layout, the footprint calculation was relatively new at this point, and I think they were playing with the design and saying, okay, well, what if we optimize the design to give us the biggest footprint to, maximize or minimize the economy that we had to hit with these CAFE standards? What would that look like? That's what this 2013 WRX concept does. When you look at this car from the front, from the rear, I mean, you can see that this is clearly where the V8 WRX came from. But if you look at it directly from the side, there's two really big differences that I want to draw your attention to. First is the front wheel, of course. It's much further forward, and the overhang between the front of the tire and basically the front of the bumper is much, much shorter compared to, what a standard WRX or STI would be. Now, if you look at the rear, and I'd only even noticed this when we started looking at this, the rear is a big difference too, because the rear wheel is so far back that there is no cutout in the rear door to accommodate for the rear wheel. It's completely behind the rear door. That drivetrain is significantly longer. It was a concept still, but it was roughly the same bumper-to-bumper length as what we ended up getting as the V8 WRX. That's what it would look like. That's what we were talking about. It would be different, but it's not that different. And if you look at, say, a lot of the modern all-wheel drive BMWs, it's like the same recipe, but just different execution in a BMW to a Subaru. And they're able to make the all-wheel drive system work and all that sort of thing. So I think there's a lot of potential here. The other thing that happened significantly in 2015 is this is when Vermont Sports Car moved to SEDEV, started using the SEDEV drivetrain, which is, again, what Arai and Subaru in Japan is using for this All-Japan Rally BRZ. Vermont Sports Car has been doing this for over a decade now. Subaru Japan is now doing this. We've seen the concept car. I just have to think that maybe Subaru has been starting to think about this and starting to do research in this direction, maybe even going back to 2013, 2015, to make another step forward with basically the handling and the drivetrain of the STI and maybe even the WRX. There's a lot of pieces of this puzzle that are starting to fall into place. This would be basically moving Subaru in a new direction. And the most exciting thing to me about that is when you think about the STI, this was one of the biggest complaints of the STI probably from 2015 to 2021, is that there was really minimal changes to the core chassis through to that point. If Subaru would make this change, this is a big leap forward. It could be a huge leap forward, especially depending on what kind of controls and differentials they would put in this new drivetrain for the combustion engine cars. This could finally be not only just bringing the car back, but like really taking it to a new level in terms of performance, handling, everything that we wanted from Subaru from 2015 to 21, but we never actually quite got. So I think there's just so much potential here for Subaru to land the plane with an STI that is going to be a huge advancement for what we know as the STI and potentially for what we know as the BRZ. And all of the pieces of the puzzle, I think, are there. Again, when you look at the Boxer Rally Spec Z all-wheel drive BRZ rally car, the GT300 BRZ race car, what Vermont Sports Car has been doing with their rally cars, these concept cars, like it all kind of fits if Subaru is thinking in this direction. And it would just push them forward, push them in a new direction. It could be just fantastic if they actually let us have something like this. Now, the last thing that I want to say, how potentially crazy is this design, or is it possible that this design is not as crazy and radical as it could be? So what I want you to think about is a GD WRX. What if we stretch the wheelbase this 6 inches that we're talking about? How crazy would that be? Well, it turns out it's not that crazy at all. It would have a wheelbase of 105.4 inches. Well, the VB sedan right now is 105.2. So it's basically just the wheelbase of the VB sedan currently. But if you're just moving that front axle forward, the length would be a little bit shorter. If you would just extend the width just ever so slightly on the GD, give it a little bit more track width to 60.2 inches. If you just stretch it in this way, you would have a footprint of 44 square feet, which is right in the ballpark of what the VB has right now, but you get that just from moving that front axle forward that 6 inches and just giving it a little bit of more of a wide body is all. Like from, I think it was 58 inches. Yeah, from 58 to 60. Just a little extra width, and you get a footprint that is what the VB has now. Like, that is the significance of trying to put the front axle that much further forward So like if they're happy with the footprint for the cafe standards numbers, that would get them there. But again, with a smaller overall car and better weight distribution, if they can make the handling work, this could be a significant improvement, over what we are even thinking of right now is what the STI could be. So that's I think what's on the table. That's what the pieces of the puzzle might be that Subaru is playing with to make something like this. I just wanted to walk through, like, again, a deep dive of what the BR Spec Z looks like, and then how some of these design changes and cues could come together to a new generation of Impreza, WRX, STI, BRZ that gives us like what is really a new Subaru, a new definition of what Subaru performance is. I really hope that Subaru's thinking in this way. I hope they're watching this one. Let me know in the comments what you think. Do you think that Subaru could do something like this? Do you think that Subaru might be working on something like this? Especially going back to 2013 to present and seeing how some of these pieces of the puzzle, the recurrence of these design elements and stuff, I really hope to think that Subaru is thinking in this direction at least a little bit. So again, let me know what you think in the comments below. Thanks so much for watching. Thanks for your support as always. And until next time, stay tuned to Flatirons Tuning.